Hey there. Imagine waking up tomorrow but not in your cozy bed or your comfy home. Nope. You open your eyes to a world of dirt, danger, and total discomfort. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time when just surviving a single day was nothing short of a miracle. Sounds dramatic? Well, stick around because by the end of this video you'll see exactly why you wouldn't last 24 hours in medieval times. We're not just talking about the obvious stuff like the lack of smartphones or running water. No, it's way deeper and darker. From gruesome diseases to repulsive hygiene habits, plus food you probably wouldn't dare to eat today, the Middle Ages was a brutal era that most of us romanticize way too much. Now, before we dive in, a quick heads up. While historians have uncovered tons of facts about medieval life, some details are still debated. So, when I say it's likely or it's believed that, know I'm staying true to what research suggests without stretching the truth. So what exactly made living back then so tough? You're about to find out 6 shocking reasons that prove life in the Middle Ages was a daily battle for survival, and why you're much safer living in the 21st century. Ready to get a little grossed out but totally fascinated? Let's jump right in. Reason 1. Terrible hygiene and its consequences. Alright, let's start with one of the biggest reasons you wouldn't survive a day in the Middle Ages: hygiene. Now, don't get me wrong, people back then did wash themselves sometimes, but the way hygiene worked, or rather didn't work, would shock you. First off, bathing was extremely rare. It's commonly believed by modern viewers that medieval people never bathed. But historians think it's more accurate to say baths were infrequent and not the daily routines we're used to today. Taking a full bath was a big deal, usually reserved for special occasions or when someone was extremely wealthy. For most folks, washing might mean wiping down with a damp cloth or rinsing hands and face, but not actual bathing. Why so rare? Well, one big reason was the fear of water spreading diseases. This idea actually made some sense at the time. Rivers and lakes were often used as sewers, and without modern sanitation, water could carry illnesses. So for many, staying dry was safer than immersing in potentially dirty water. Add to that, houses didn't have running water. People relied on wells, streams, or communal fountains, which made regular washing less convenient. Soap existed but wasn't widely used or easy to come by for poor peasants. Those who could afford it might use soap made from animal fats and ashes, but it was expensive and harsh on the skin. Now, what about the consequences of such poor hygiene? The big one was infestations. Lice, fleas, ticks, and other parasites thrived in the crowded, damp conditions of medieval homes and clothing. Chronic infestations weren't just annoying, they spread deadly diseases. For example, the flea carried the bacterium that caused the Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics ever. Another consequence was skin infections and diseases. Without washing, sores, boils, and other infections could easily become serious. People also had to deal with itch diseases caused by scabies mites, which made life miserable. Even teeth weren't safe. Medieval people didn't brush their teeth like we do, and sugary food, butter, honey, fruits, could actually promote bad dental health. Tooth decay and loss were common. And here's a gross but fascinating detail. Clothing wasn't washed often either. Changing clothes was rare because making new garments was time-consuming and expensive. The smell and dirtiness of clothes added to the overall feeling of uncleanliness. Of course, it wasn't all doom and gloom. People tried their best with the knowledge and resources they had. Some baths were taken in bathhouses, especially in towns, and herbal rinses were common. Some even believed certain smells or plants could protect against disease or evil spirits. In short, medieval hygiene was a far cry from our standards, and living in these conditions would be incredibly uncomfortable and dangerous for anyone used to modern cleanliness. This lack of hygiene set the stage for many other problems like disease, which we'll explore next. Reason 2. Deadly diseases and devastating epidemics. If poor hygiene was one of the biggest troubles in medieval life, then deadly diseases were the ultimate threat. Medieval Europe was plagued by illnesses that could wipe out entire communities in a matter of months. The worst of all, the infamous Black Death, which killed an estimated 25 million people, or about 1/3 of Europe's population, in the 14th century alone. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Disease was a constant companion throughout the Middle Ages, and it came in many forms. The medical knowledge of the time was limited, often based on superstitions or flawed theories like the miasma theory, which blamed bad air for spreading sickness. Doctors had no idea about bacteria, viruses, or even how medicine truly worked. One of the most common killers was the plague, caused by bacteria carried by fleas that infested rats, common in medieval towns. Once the fleas bit humans, the disease spread rapidly, causing fever, painful swelling of lymph nodes known as buboes, and often death within days. This was the Black Death, also called the bubonic plague. It was terrifying, fast and uncontrollable. But the Black Death wasn't the only one. Smallpox, typhus, tuberculosis, and cholera were also frequent killers. Epidemics would sweep through villages and cities, striking down the young, elderly, and weak alike. Without vaccines or antibiotics, people had little hope of survival. Interestingly, some medieval people tried various treatments, herbs, bloodletting, praying to saints, but most were ineffective or even harmful. The lack of understanding made it hard to control outbreaks, so quarantines and isolation were rare and haphazard. The impact of disease went beyond just death rates. The sheer scale of loss caused massive social and economic disruption. Labor shortages meant farms and towns struggled, which sometimes led to uprisings and changes in power structures. Almost everyone lived with the fear that illness could strike at any moment. So, imagining yourself in medieval times means facing not just daily hard work and discomfort, but also the real and present danger of deadly disease lurking everywhere, from your own home to crowded marketplaces. And since many diseases were spread by fleas and lice from poor hygiene, this links back to our first reason, making survival even harder. Historians believe that understanding these diseases is crucial to understanding medieval life as a whole. Like many facts from this era, there are debates about the exact nature of certain outbreaks or treatments, but the terrifying reality of these illnesses is undeniable. Reason 3. Unsafe and scarce food. Now that we've covered hygiene and deadly diseases, it's time to talk about something we all love, food. But in the Middle Ages, eating wasn't quite the enjoyable experience we imagine today. In fact, food scarcity and unsafe eating habits were major challenges that could put your survival at serious risk. For most people in medieval Europe, especially peasants, meals were simple and repetitive. The diet was largely based on grains like rye, barley, and oats, often made into porridge or bread. Vegetables and legumes, such as beans and cabbage, were common too, but meat was a rare luxury typically reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. Some researchers believe that around 80% of the population were malnourished or undernourished at various times. Now, it wasn't just the lack of food that was the problem. Food safety was a big issue too. Without refrigeration or modern preservation methods, food spoiled quickly, especially in warm weather. People had to rely on smoking, salting, or pickling to preserve meat and fish, but these methods weren't always effective. Poor preservation led to foodborne illnesses like botulism or parasites, which could cause anything from stomach aches to fatal consequences. Worse, contamination was everywhere. With limited understanding of germs, food could easily become contaminated by unwashed hands, animals, or spoiled ingredients. Water used for cooking was often unsafe, increasing the risks of intestinal diseases. Another surprising aspect, many foods we consider staples today were unknown or rarely grown in medieval Europe. For example, potatoes, tomatoes, and corn only arrived after the discovery of the Americas in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Fruit was seasonal and often expensive, and sweets were usually made with honey rather than sugar, which was a luxury. Interestingly, some believe that medieval peasants grew or ate certain vegetables and fruits we no longer commonly eat today, such as parsnips, turnips, or elderberries. Researchers are still exploring which foods were common and their nutritional value, so phrases like "it's believed" or "likely" remind us of ongoing historical debates. And then there's the matter of food-related superstition and customs. Some medieval people believed certain foods had magical properties, or illnesses could be avoided by eating specific herbs. Whether true or not, these beliefs shaped diets and survival strategies. To sum it up, Food in the Middle Ages was not only scarce but also risky. The chances of eating spoiled or contaminated food were high, and malnutrition weakened many, making them more vulnerable to disease and other hardships. Reason 4. Violence and constant danger. If unhygienic living and deadly diseases weren't enough to keep you on edge, the Middle Ages was also a time when violence was an ever-present reality. Whether you lived in a bustling town, a peaceful village, or a grand castle, threats could come from all directions, making survival a daily challenge. First, let's talk about warfare. The medieval period is famous for its wars, sieges, and battles, from local feuds between nobles to full-scale conflicts like the Crusades or the 100 Years' War. The fighting was brutal and unforgiving. Knights in armor clashed with swords and axes, armies used catapults and siege weapons to attack castles, and civilians often found themselves caught in the crossfire or victims of pillaging. But even if you weren't a soldier, you weren't safe. Crime rates were high in many areas, with bandits and thieves preying on travelers and isolated villages. Law enforcement was limited, and justice could be harsh, often involving public punishments such as flogging, mutilation, or even execution. The threat of violence extended beyond physical attacks and combat. Punishments for crimes often involved gruesome torture techniques designed to extract confessions or serve as a warning to others. Devices such as the rack, thumbscrews, and iron maidens were used in some regions, illustrating just how dangerous the justice system could be for the accused. Additionally, local feuds between rival families or communities could erupt into violent clashes or vendettas lasting years. People lived with the constant fear that a conflict could flare up at any moment, turning their surroundings into battlegrounds. Even daily life was influenced by violence. Disputes over land, resources, or social position sometimes ended in bloody fights. Peasants working on land owned by nobles could face brutal treatment or forced labor. Women, children, and the elderly often suffered the consequences of these social tensions. One thing to note is that medieval people had different attitudes toward violence than we do today. Life was harsh, and many accepted warfare and punishment as normal parts of society. Honor, loyalty, and religious faith played crucial roles in motivating warriors and shaping conduct on the battlefield. Still, it's hard to imagine living with so much danger looming over you day and night. The risk of being arrested for a minor crime, attacked by a stranger, or caught in a siege meant that medieval life was as physically and emotionally exhausting as it was unpredictable. Historians agree that violence in the Middle Ages was not just a series of isolated events, but part of a larger social and political context. Understanding this helps us see why peace and security were prized and how people adapted to survive in such a volatile world. In conclusion, the constant threat of violence from war, crime, punishment, and social unrest made medieval life extraordinarily dangerous, another powerful reason why we wouldn't last a day back then. Reason 5. Harsh living conditions and lack of comfort. Alongside disease, violence, and poor hygiene, another major challenge the medieval people faced was their harsh living conditions. The comforts many of us take for granted today, like warm homes, comfortable beds, and consistent shelter, were luxuries far beyond the reach of most medieval folks. The vast majority of people during the Middle Ages were peasants living in small villages or rural areas. Their homes were simple structures, usually made from wood, mud, and straw or stone in some regions. These buildings were often poorly insulated, lacked glass windows, and had dirt or packed earth floors. Fireplaces provided heat, but they were smoky and inefficient. Imagine trying to keep warm through long freezing winters with just a smoky fire and a thin layer of animal skins or rough blankets to cover you. Heat was a major problem. Winters were brutal, and many people didn't have enough food or proper clothing to stay warm. Frostbite and hypothermia were real risks, and survival was as much about staying warm as it was about finding enough food. Sanitation was non-existent by modern standards. Waste, including human and animal, was often disposed of near homes or in the streets. In towns, narrow alleys might be clogged with garbage and refuse, creating foul smells and attracting rats. This contributed to disease spread, adding insult to injury. Sleeping arrangements were basic. Families often shared small rooms and beds, sometimes with animals inside for warmth or guarding against intruders. Mattresses filled with straw or feathers were rare and expensive. So many people had to make do with hard, uncomfortable sleeping surfaces. Privacy and personal space were non-existent for most. The concept of comfort as we know it was very different. People accepted hardships as part of daily life, and the struggle to stay warm, dry, and safe was constant. On top of the physical discomforts, frequent natural disasters like floods, fires, and harsh weather could quickly devastate homes and food supplies. The medieval peasant's life was precarious, with little margin for error or bad luck. Castles and manor houses offered better conditions for the elite, but even they faced their share of discomforts: drafty halls, cold stone walls, and smoky rooms without modern ventilation. Luxury by medieval standards was different from ours, often based more on security and status than actual comfort. Despite these hardships, medieval people developed clever ways to cope: heavy cloaks, layered clothing, and communal living that kept warm air circulating. But these solutions only went so far. Ultimately, surviving under such harsh living conditions required constant endurance and adaptability. The lack of basic comforts we enjoy today was another enormous challenge that would make surviving a day in medieval times nearly impossible for modern people. Reason 6. Lack of scientific knowledge and technology. So far, we've talked about hygiene, disease, food, violence, and hard living conditions as reasons why you wouldn't last a day in the Middle Ages. But there's a bigger underlying factor that ties all these problems together: medieval society's lack of scientific knowledge and technology. When we think of science and technology today, we imagine breakthroughs in medicine, sanitation, communication, and transportation that make our lives easier and safer. But back in the Middle Ages, much of this knowledge was either non-existent, misunderstood, or tied up in superstition and religion. Take medicine, for example. Medieval doctors often relied on ancient Greek and Roman texts, like those from Galen and Hippocrates, but their remedies were limited and sometimes harmful. Bloodletting, cutting a patient to balance the humors, was a common treatment, though it often weakened them further. People believed diseases were punishments from God or caused by bad air, the so-called miasma theory. Germ theory, which explains how microbes cause illness, wouldn't be discovered for centuries. Sanitation was another challenge. Cities and towns had no real sewage system. Waste disposal was primitive, which led to polluted water and streets. People didn't understand the link between dirty water and disease, so even wells and drinking sources were often contaminated. This lack of sanitation fueled widespread epidemics like the Black Death. Agriculture, the backbone of medieval life, was also limited by available technology. Tools were basic, and farming relied heavily on manual labor and simple plows. Crop rotation was known but not perfect, which limited food production and made famines a frequent threat. Communication and transportation were slow and difficult. Without printing presses, books were scarce and expensive, and news spread mainly by word of mouth or slow travel. This meant that new ideas, scientific discoveries, or medical advancements took a long time to reach people. Even everyday conveniences were absent. No electricity, no proper heating systems, no clean water on tap. Life was poor in part because people simply did not have access to technologies that could improve their health and comfort. Despite these obstacles, the medieval period was not without progress. Monasteries preserved ancient knowledge, and scholars made strides in astronomy, architecture, and philosophy. However, many discoveries were limited to the elite or religious institutions and didn't reach the average person's daily life. Understanding this lack of scientific and technological advancement is crucial to fully grasping why survival was so difficult. Without the tools or knowledge to prevent and treat disease, improve living conditions, or advance agriculture, medieval people faced dangers that modern society has largely overcome. So when you picture the Middle Ages, remember that the biggest challenge might not just have been the visible hardships, but the invisible limitations of knowledge. And that's why surviving even one day in that world was an extraordinary feat. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval realities, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss out on more fascinating history and surprising facts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.